All he could taste was dirt. Dry, coarse dirt. He wasn't sure how long he'd been like this either. As he tried to lift his arms up, he felt dirt shifting around them. It took a bit, but he slowly clawed through the dirt until he could feel them break through the soil and into the air. Then he began to kick and twist his legs as he tried to drag more dirt away from his face. When he finally cleared away the dirt from his eyes, he opened them to see the full moon hanging up in the night sky before him. Slowly but surely he pushed and twisted to wriggle and dig himself up out of the ground until he could finally roll out of the shallow grave. For several minutes he lay there, gasping hard as he tried to catch his breath. He was tired. More tired than he'd ever been before. He wasn't even sure he had the energy to push himself up to see feet. His lips were dry and cracked, and his tongue felt like sandpaper in his mouth. But he needed to get up. He had to get up. Even as he tried to push down, though his arms wobbled and gave out as he flopped back down into the dirt. Groaning in pain and dismay, he tried once more, but again he couldn't do it, and lay on the dusty top of the plateau. He closed his eyes but tried not to fall asleep. He wasn't sure if he could wake up again this time. He just lay there, listening. The far-off call of a sweeper, the buzz of some elk beetles, and even the chittering of some lava lizards. It was peaceful here. Too peaceful. He couldn't give in to the gentle noise trying to lull him back into an endless sleep. So he tried to push himself up once more time. He got partway up and then collapsed yet again as he let out frustrated scream, which used most of his remaining energy. Once more, all he could taste was dirt. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, his ribs creaking and groaning with every breath. But then, to his great surprise, a canteen dropped in front of his face. He flinched a bit, though all he could move was his face. Even as he reached out to take it, he paused and looked up. Before him was a figure that caught him off guard. He wore a black cassock with red trim and a long crimson sash wrapped around his waist along with a pistol. Even religious folk carried irons around here. What was a father doing out here? Though he'd never seen the red before, was he a cardinal or even a saint? "What will it cost?" he asked as he slowly closed his dirty cut-up hands around the canteen. "The water shall cost nothing." "Water always costs something out here, friend," he croaked out, coughing up a bit more dirt. "It shall cost you but a moment of time to listen to a proposal then." The gunslinger hesitated and then unscrewed the cap before taking a first small sip, then a bigger sip. Finally, he started to just drink it all. The water was as clean and clear as crystal. It was so cold he could swear he was drinking from a snow well. It was so cold it almost hurt his parched, dry throat as he drank it down. It was like the water was breathing new life into him as all the aches and pains in his body faded away. When the canteen had run dry, he finally had the energy so slowly push himself up and onto his feet. Though he felt a bit shaky still, he tried to get a look at the figure's face, but some reason he couldn't. It was like his head was covered in a dark shroud that couldn't be pierced by the light of the full moon above. "It looks like you walked into an ambush." "That it does." The gunslinger looked around the top of the plateau. The bodies of the marauders he had slain were gone. But that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that they even bothered to toss him into a shallow grave. He had heard they liked to use up the bodies as fertilizer, but there weren't any plants here for his body to sustain. "Did they take my guns?" "Your rifle, but not your pistol." The figure extended a long, rather thin arm and pointed when the gunslinger noticed the black gloves on the priest's hand. Turning, he slowly staggered over to the rock the figure had pointed at, and sure enough, there was his iron being covered by the rock. He clicked open the cylinder and spun it out as he pulled the cases free. He had one bullet left, and it had his name carved into the side. A gift from his son, so that he'd always be holding the bullet with his name on it, to keep him safe. He tucked it into his chest pocket by his heart. "What's the proposition?" "It's simple. I give you a new glider and a bullet." The gunslinger looked around the plateau, but he already knew that his glider would be gone. Not even marauders would leave behind a good bluestone glider, if not to use, then to tear apart for the bits inside. "And what will this cost me?" The figure was quiet for a few seconds, as if considering the cost before it finally spoke once more. Everything. The gunslinger had a feeling it would cost him that. He looked down at the gun in his hand and thought about his family, so far away, and so vulnerable without him. "Deal." He extended his hand then, and the figure slowly raised his in turn. As the gunslinger reached out to shake hands, he gasped softly at just how cold the figure's hands were. How could they be that cold, especially with gloves on? He shivered a little as it felt like a line of frost ran down his spine, and then the figure let go. Reaching down to the holster on his waist, the figure pulled free a bullet and handed it to the gunslinger, who quickly loaded it into his pistol before tucking. "And the glider?" he asked, as the figure reached up and slid the straps off his back. The straps had been so perfectly black, they blended in with the figure's cassock, so he hadn't seen it. "Take mine. I have more." When the figure unslung the glider and swung it around to hand it to the gunslinger, he was taken aback by the look of it. He'd seen a few fancy ones before, usually brass with inlaid gems or stained glass, but his looked like the main casing was carved from a single giant skull. A flying serpent skull based on the teeth jutting out from the bottom. It was beautiful in a haunting way. "How will you collect? When will you collect?" "I shall collect when and where it is appropriate." "Of course." The gunslinger sighed for a moment and shook his head. "Doesn't matter. The deal was still worth it. I'll see you around then." He was about to turn and walk away when the figure spoke again. "You should take the canteen. You might need it." "It's empty," the gunslinger said with a shrug. "Is it?" As the figure asked that, the gunslinger hesitated and then reached down to pick the canteen up once more. But when he straightened up, the figure was gone. He looked all around the plateau but couldn't see any signs of him, just the remains of the marauder camp he'd been hired to clear. The camp that had been waiting for him. But were they waiting for him truly? Or anyone? It was hard to say. After opening the canteen once more, he found more water inside. Confused but thankful for the mystery, the gunslinger took a few more deep gulps and then splashed some on his face to try and wash away at least a little dirt. With that done, he pulled the strap for the canteen over his shoulder and then reached down into the dirt of his grave. After a moment of digging, he pulled out his hat, batting it against his leg to knock most of the dirt off before setting it on his head. After that, he looked around the plateau trying to get his bearings. The distant horizon was starting to glow orange-red with the coming of a new dawn, and once he finally saw the top sliver of the sun, he set it to his back, facing away from it. He ran then straight at the edge of the plateau and jumped as he reached the edge. Triggering the wings, they snapped out of the glider strapped to his back, and as he fell towards the lava below, he caught one of the many updrafts to carry him back up to land on the next pillar in the sea of lava, run across it, and jump once more. On he ran, jumping and diving off the edge of pillar after pillar. He was no stranger to crossing the broken spires. Sometimes he could catch a longer draft, spinning through the air as the winds carried him forward. The pack was lighter than he expected, given the size. It hardly seemed to weigh upon him at all, though that might just be his mindset onto the distant task he was running towards. Once, long ago, he had relished this sort of travel, to almost fly free as a bird, to twist and drift between the currents of air that carried his wings. But that was nothing but long, dead memories in the depths of his mind now. The sun at his back began to climb higher as he ran. The flat, barren plateaus of the spires giving him no protection from the heat that began to steadily rise. Even when he'd jump and dive, the winds coursing around him were hot swells from the lava below and did little to cool him off. But he didn't care. His lips could crack and his tongue run dry all over again, but it wouldn't stop him. Not now. Not this time. The sun was high, beating down upon him when he finally saw the smoke in the distance. Smoke where there shouldn't be any. He adjusted his course a little, though he didn't have to change it much. It was one of the larger plateaus in the area, a small dry pond at the center surrounded by bigger boulders and rocks that filled in the rain season. Some gnarled, twisted bone trees surrounding the pond. Twisted and evil as they looked, he'd seen their beauty and splendor when they bloomed. But the next rain wasn't for months. As he got closer, he could hear the distant sound. The crack and pop of rifles, the boom of cannon, and the snap and whistle of the marauder staffs. He picked up his pace a little, wondering if these were the ones who had ambushed him. Perhaps his journey would be over already. When he landed on the edge of the spire, he began to creep between the boulders, hoisting his pistol in his hand, aware that he only had 2 bullets. One really, since he didn't dare use the one with his name on it yet. He could hear the shouting ahead as the battle raged on while he navigated the maze of boulders that shielded the dry pond bed in the middle. He rounded a rock and then pressed himself back against it as he saw a marauder before him, crouched behind a rock up ahead. It would peek over the top, tilting its staff up before it would snap and whistle as a blue bolt shot forth, then hunker back down to wait for the crystals set into the shaft to spin back into place. The gunslinger never trusted the damn things, a gun he could understand. But that thing? He wasn't the only one to be stumped by them, of course. Ever since the old kingdoms had first set foot on this new land, they had been beset by marauders. No one knew what they were. They scurried and crawled in so very many different ways. Some on all 4s, others on 6, though many on just 2, but with odd numbers of appendages either way. Small arms or what looked to be amputated limbs sticking out at odd angles. Their twisted, broken faces hidden behind their intricate masks, stitched together with the hair of the humans they killed. How could one define a species that seemingly had no set order, size, or build? The raids and attacks had been light at first around the first landings and early colonies. But once the settlers had discovered bluestone and the properties it held, like the ability to lift ships out of the water and above the lava, well, that had led to an explosion of growth and far more marauders down from the north. No one knew where they came from. No expedition to the crown had ever returned. But for now, the gunslinger was less focused on history and more on the immediate threat before him. This one had just 2 arms and 2 legs, or at least the thick wool of his poncho and wrappings were only cut with holes for 2 arms and 2 legs. There might be smaller ones underneath. He waited for it to peek up over the top of the rock once more and rushed closer. It had just fired when he was behind it, yanking back hard on its oily black hair and jamming his pistol up under his chin as he pulled the trigger. The blue blood and green-gray brains that splattered across the gunslinger was quickly ignored as he kicked the body out from behind the rock so he could duck behind it and use it for cover himself. Holstering his pistol, he then grabbed the marauder's staff, letting the crystals spin back into place while he peered over the top of the rock to see what was going on. Ahead, almost in the middle of the pond, was a frigate. Crashed hard from the looks of things, cracked and broken into the ground and leaning heavily to the side. Looked to be a wood one with a few iron plates slapped on the side. Not a proper iron ship, then. Soldiers were huddled around it, firing in all directions, as more marauders peppered them with blue bolts from the rocks and trees around them. In the center, he could see an officer with more courage than sense, holding the stars and strikers aloft in her hand and a pistol in the other as she directed fire. Even now, she wasn't ready to let the good old red, white, and black fall to the earth. Out front was a cannon they had apparently salvaged, but the crew was taking too much fire to get out and load it again. The gunslinger looked at his new staff and saw that the crystals were finally lined up. He turned to his left then and waited to see another marauder mask pop up from the rock down the way. When he did, he thumbed the small gem at the center of the staff and felt it jerk in his hands as it snapped, and with a whistle, the blue bolt shot straight out and into the marauder's face. There was a hiss and a flash from the impact as the mask shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces and the face behind it was burned into a charred lump. Then he ducked back down. He reached out to grip one of the crystals with his left hand, hissing out as his flesh burned, but he turned it forward faster to bring them all into alignment yet again. Leaning up, he took aim once more and saw another mask for a moment before he fired, yet again, turning a marauder's face into a charred lump. But now they realized what was going on. There was hissing and clicking, even some loud whistles and piercing wails as they communicated what was going on. He kept low and moved away from the rock he was behind then as he heard more snaps and whistles as bolts slammed into the rock he'd just been behind. Moving around to the left, he circled some bigger boulders and peeked around to see a cluster of marauders in the distance. These must be the ones suppressing the cannon, he figured, as he could see them working in tandem to always have a staff ready to fire as each one would pop out in sequence. He needed to time this right, because if he shot one, then the others could just turn and focus on him, and he'd never be able to get another shot off without one of them being ready for it. So he watched them closely for a minute. 4 arms on the left, twin tail next to him, blue mask further right, and red legs to start charging his staff again, and then pulled out of cover and ran straight at the cluster. He resisted the urge to yell, since that would just give him away, and managed to be nearly upon the first marauder when he turned and saw the gunslinger. Red Leg hissed and licked in surprise, but the gunslinger was jamming the tip of his captured staff into the marauder's gut as he thumbed the gem. This time, instead of a snap and a whistle was a snap and a loud, wet pop as the marauder's torso exploded in a shower of blue blood and guts. But the gunslinger once again ignored that and grabbed Red Leg's staff, swiftly leveling it at Blue Mask and thumbing the trigger to shoot the next marauder in the back. 4 arms and twin tail were aware of the surprise attack by now and rolled off the top of the rock to face him directly. He spun the staff around in his hands to smash it across Twin Tail's skull as the metal and wood shattered, staggering the creature as he jumped up to grab Blue Mask's staff off the rock where the dead marauder had dropped it. 4 arms was lunging at him now, though, and the gunslinger barely had time to bring the new staff up to knock aside the creature's claws that swiped at his face. It hissed at him beneath the mask and lunged once more, simply tackling him to the ground then. The gunslinger grunted and gasped as he was knocked to the ground beneath the marauder, holding up the staff between them to try and keep it off, wincing at the smell of its rancid breath as a puff of black air escaped its mask. Behind 4 arms, Twin Tail had recovered, shaking his head and adjusting his cracked mask as he raised his staff. But with 4 arms on top of the gunslinger, he didn't have a clear shot. Hissing and clicking, he was no doubt telling 4 arms to get off so he had a shot. When 4 arms looked back, the gunslinger used his moment of hesitation to his advantage. He shoved hard with the staff, twisting it as he did to slip the staff up between the marauder's 2 left arms, and aimed at Twin Tails when he thumbed the gem. As it snapped and whistled, the bolt slammed the marauder in the chest, sending him tumbling back. With most of 4 arms' bulk off of him now, the gunslinger rolled forward, reaching out as far as he could while the marauder tangled with his legs. 4 arms hissed, and the gunslinger gasped as he felt claws digging into the flesh of his legs through his pants, but he grabbed the staff Twin Tails had dropped and rolled over, aiming it down between his legs, jamming the staff into 4 arms' face before firing. Much like with Red Leg, instead of a snap and a whistle this time, it was a snap and a wet pop, as 4 arms' head exploded, coating the gunslinger in yet more blue blood and green-gray brains, the heat of the explosion singing his legs a bit as well, causing him to hiss in pain. But he pushed through it, kicking the corpse free of his legs and getting up behind the rock they were using as cover. "Your cannon should be clear!" he called out. "Who the fuck is that?" He heard a voice call out. "Doesn't fucking matter. Load it! Load it now before the ogre returns!" Was that what had downed the frigate? The gunslinger peeked over the top of the rock and saw the soldiers rushing to load the cannon, even as he heard the bellowing roar of the ogre from just outside the circle of bone trees. There was a soldier just at the edge of the trees who looked up and screamed as the gunslinger saw a massive, gnarled hand crush the unlucky bastard into the tree, turning his brown and red uniform into mostly red. It stomped into the clearing then, 4 large, chubby legs ending in stubby feet. What wasn't pinkish, boil-laden flesh was covered beneath painted wrappings and a massive mask. Considering how many hairs were needed to stitch it together, it must have killed hundreds of people by now. Only a single giant purple eye was exposed from the top of the mask as it bellowed out, 2 fat arms raising to the sky as it began to charge the downed frigate. Thankfully, the gun crew were faster, though, and the loader had only just cleared the mouth of the gun when another crewman yanked the cord to fire. The cannonball shot straight and true as it slammed through the ogre's front right leg, amputating it at the knee before slamming into the back right leg, smashing it into a twisted mess of bone, sinew, and flesh. The ogre screamed as it toppled over, its eye flashing as a purple beam shot out wildly, cutting through some of the downed frigate's sails and rigging. The soldiers cried and cursed as they dove and ran for cover to avoid the falling debris, but the gunslinger ignored them as he ran forward. He knew the ogre might be down, but it wasn't out, and a staff wouldn't cut it. Tossing aside the marauder weapon, he ran towards the soldier who had been smashed into the bone tree. Thankfully, his carbine hadn't been crushed in the blow, and the gunslinger grabbed it, rolling as 2 or 3 whistling blue bolts sailed through the air he'd just been in. As he came up to his feet, he aimed at a marauder across the clearing and pulled the trigger. He was rewarded with a splash of blue in the air as the marauder's head snapped back. Then he worked the lever on the carbine and ran towards the downed ogre as it twisted and writhed, trying to push itself back up. It was trying to reposition its head at the cannon still being reloaded when he jumped up onto its back firing point, blank into the back of its head, the bullet lodging deep into the back of its skull. But that just made the ogre howl in anger and jerk around, fat hands trying to reach back and swat him off. He ducked under the stubby fat fingers and gripped the back of the mask for support, letting it swing blindly a few more times before working the lever and shooting it in the back of the skull once more. This time, as it bellowed in anger and pain, it flopped hard to its side, which sent the gunslinger flying off. But he rolled as he sailed through the air and came up on his feet. The ogre tried to look at him for a moment, but the cannon crew had other plans. "Fire!" the captain yelled before the roar of the cannon filled the air, and the cannonball succeeded where his bullets had failed. It punched a hole straight through the ogre's mask, shattering it into pieces that went flying as the cannonball tore through the flesh and bone of its skull. It didn't even go all the way through, but the monstrosity slumped to its side, dead just the same. There were cheers from the soldiers as the remaining marauders on the far side of the clearing began to run, skitter, and scramble away. But the captain just raised her pistol and shouted, "Quit cheering and shoot, you idiots!" The gunslinger was already ahead of her as he ran after them, working the lever on the carbine, raising it to his shoulder, firing, and then repeating the action in an almost mechanical fashion. One more marauder, 2, 3, 4, click. He looked down at the carbine and sighed as it was out of bullets. He'd used all 7. As the soldiers ran after the fleeing marauders to give chase, he looped back to the wrecked frigate and began to pick bullets off one of the other dead soldiers. That's government property. He looked up as the captain stood over him, her pistol holstered but the flag still in her other hand as it fluttered in the breeze. It had a few singe marks from marauder bolts, but it was still flying. "Should I give it back?" the gunslinger asked as he stopped his rummaging. The captain looked around the clearing for a moment as her wounded were dragged into the shade of the wreck so their sawbones could look them over. "Fuck it. We lose property out here plenty." She shrugged. "What are you doing out here, gunslinger? Can't be a bounty for 100 miles in any direction. More." "I wasn't out here for a bounty," he mentioned as he went back to pulling bullets from the dead man's satchel and tucking them into his own belt. There was a nest. I went to clear it. Half a day east. They were expecting me. He nodded his head and rose up, walking to another body to start rummaging through his gear. While that does explain why you're way the fuck out here without a night pack, I still want to know who the hell would pay you to clear a nest out here, and why just one? This place is littered with them, the captain asked as he worked. I wasn't paid. I was told this area was supposed to be safe, he replied as she let out a short laugh. Safe, my ass. If you mean to say there haven't been many attacks, that's true, but it's only because they've got a war chief somewhere gathering them up. And a man like you doesn't do anything without pay. I know your type. Marauders aren't your specialty, are they? You're behaving like a homesteader. The gunslinger paused at that, and then resumed looting the body before him as she laughed once more. Ha! A gunslinger turned homesteader? Out here? You can't be that dumb. Cheap land, grand opportunities, unclaimed wealth, untapped potential. A prospector I could trust. Thought I could trust. He muttered before stopping and rising up. He had enough bullets for now. He moved to check the marauder corpses nearby. Have you seen any with brown talismans? He walked over to the nearest corpse, turning it over as he looked for the talismans. They wove little bits of metal and shiny things into their wrappings under their ponchos, but they all had a prized talisman they kept. They were little planks of some strange material no one could find elsewhere, studded with bits of metal all across them. Most were green, but he'd seen red, blue, and last night brown. The bodies here had green talismans, it seemed, as he tossed the religious artifact aside. These are the first we've fought on the ground, the captain mentioned. Outposts saw distress flares from Fort Hemming early yesterday morning. A day after he had left, we were sent to find out what was up, but obviously we didn't make it. Look, you helped us out of a bad spot. If you wait, another ship should be along in a day or two, and I'll make sure you have a berth waiting for you. We'll get you back to Fountain Spire at least. I can't wait, and I'm not going south, the gunslinger said as he began to walk west once more. You're crazy. So you invested in a sand pit? You can't be so stubborn as to try and save it. The marauders are out in force. They might have sealed off the Heartbreak Pass. If they did, there's no getting through for a day to north or south. She followed after him as he walked to the edge of the spire. I know. His pistol freshly loaded and his holster full of bullets, he turned to look back at her and reached up to tip the brim of his hat, a gesture she returned before he faced west and jumped, carbine gripped tight in his hands as he dove, picked up by the hot winds once more when his glider wings snapped out. The sun beat down on him through the rest of the day. He wasn't sure how long the canteen would last, even though every time he opened it, it felt full, so he took small sips each time, rationing what might possibly never end. But he didn't want to risk being a glutton only to be dry when he needed it most. The miles dragged on, and the hours passed with his constant trek west. The sun curling overhead before it began to dip back down the horizon. Even as it shone in his face, and he had to squint and avert his gaze, he didn't stop moving. As his legs ached and muscles began to beg for rest, he would keep moving along each plateau and dive down yet again to be carried up by the strong air currents lifted by the lava between the spires. He could see Heartbreak Pass in the distance, as the sun illuminated the distant gap in the ridge of even taller plateaus and spires. It was too far in from the edge to get enough wind to fly over, so travelers had to walk down one of the two gaps, which when viewed from the distance looked like two halves of a heart, broken down the middle. As the sun finally sank beyond the horizon and the sky was left orange with its departure, he looked for the telltale signs of fires that any encamped marauders would have going. But he saw none. While the shadow of night began to take over the land and the sky grew ever darker, the stars came out, shining bright above him, far brighter than in the city he'd grown up in. He'd always loved to lay back and stare at them late into the night while the moon crawled across the sky. But tonight, he didn't even glance up. By the time he finally made it to the more solid row of rock that blocked his path, the sun had set completely. But the light of a full moon gave him enough to see by. He wasn't quite sure which path to take, the left or the right, but as he walked closer, he saw something that chose for him. A nomad woman was sitting on a boulder besides the left path. He wasn't a fool. He hadn't stumbled across her by chance. She was letting him see her. Even as he walked closer, he could see the pearlescent glow of her eyes, like a cat's eyes when they caught the reflection of light in the dark. She had her cloak wrapped around her body as nomads always did. It was painted and colored to blend right in with the rocks around her in such a way that he was positive if she covered her head and rifle, he'd never have seen her. But she wasn't covering up. She was sitting upright, the top end of her rifle poking up from under the cloak as well, her curled horns of bone and deep blue sparkling opal flickering in the light of the full moon. Marauders had always used staffs, but nomads used rifles. And they liked them long, longer than they were tall. No one knew where they got them or who made the bullets. They weren't like any he'd seen made, and no one had ever seen any signs of a nomad forge. But they got them from somewhere. As the gunslinger passed by the boulder, the nomad was perched on top of. He reached up to gently tug the brim of his hat as he passed. The nomad, for her part, dipped her head and her horns a moment. Then she shifted, stretching out atop the boulder as her cloak fluttered a moment, and then settled atop her as she positioned her rifle facing east. Even though he knew exactly where she was still hard to see. No marauders would be coming through the pass so long as she was there. He wasn't sure why he had earned this gift, but he was thankful for it. On he walked throughout the night, ignoring the continued protests of his limbs and body as his muscles ached and groaned. He was too driven by his purpose to be stopped now by anything short of death itself. It took him half the night to walk the length of the pass, his only company the soft call of the owls that hunted what few rodents lived in such a desolate and unwelcoming terrain. Once he reached the other side, his usual pattern of diving and climbing, the wind started fresh once more. He was getting closer now, and he could feel the anxiety building within him with every step closer to his goal. By the time finally rose to his back, he had gained miles more on his destination, never ceasing, just taking small sips of that cold, refreshing water from the canteen the stranger had given him. Many a man might think hard on that gift, but not the gunslinger. He didn't have room for such concerns in his heart. Not now. As the sun began to steadily climb in the sky once more, he came across one of the few landmarks in this region of the broken spires, a bluestone mine he'd seen in the distance. He wasn't sure what the miners could do to help, but at the very least they might have news of the goings-on, or anyone he could convince to come with, just in case his worst fears were realized. As he grew closer to the mine, he frowned at the setup of the buildings. It didn't look quite like any bluestone mine he'd been to before. What was off about it? No guard towers, and he couldn't see any distinct barracks either. His frown deepened, even as he caught the last hot gust of air to fly him up onto the edge of the large spire the mine was positioned on. What sort of mine didn't have a barracks or guard towers? But he could see the white steam rising from the central shaft, which meant it had to be operational. They didn't even have lookouts in case marauders or human bandits showed up. Where was the singing? It wasn't like they could carry any half-worthy tune, but he was used to hearing miners sing while they worked, to help pass the time if nothing else. But this place was quiet. Quiet enough to make the hairs rise on the back of his neck as he wondered what was wrong with this place, until he finally saw the first of the workers moving a wheelbarrow full of bluestone from the central shaft to the processing mill. Clockers. That's why it was all wrong. He was the only living thing here. Even as he walked into the center of the compound, the clockers all around him just kept working without paying any attention. Their mechanical clockwork bodies never tiring from simple labor strains like men. Most of these didn't even have wind-up keys in the back. Must be some new models he wasn't familiar with. He'd heard Cogs go on and on about the great inventor himself and his divine vision, but the gunslinger had met the man once. He wasn't a great inventor. He was a nervous little man with broken glasses who had been swept up in something greater than himself. The question was, why were clockers mining bluestone? Wasn't there laws against using clockers for manual labor over able-bodied living people? There had been unrest and riots over that very issue if the papers and wires from the cities were right. But he didn't have time for that. "Hey, I need help," he said, and the nearest few clockers stopped in their tracks, their mechanical heads turning to face him, deep blue eyes examining him. It started a chain reaction throughout the entire mine as they all stopped in their work and began to gather around him. The gunslinger looked around nervously once he was surrounded, but finally one of the clockers opened its hinged wooden jaw and spoke. "I help." He stepped forward and pulled a small piece of its foot off and set it before the gunslinger. Then another stepped forward. "I help." It picked another piece from its foot to set besides the first piece. On it went then, as they would all step forward, pulling a piece of themselves off and setting it into place with the others. The gunslinger stood there, watching as they began to build a clocker before him, each of the others giving what they could spare without sacrificing anything they couldn't. It was built up piece by piece over the span of minutes. It looked different from the others, too, he noted. The body seemed bulkier, the arms and legs heavier and more robust. Finally, it stood hunched over, missing only a head. That's when they parted, and he saw the foreman. It slowly walked forward on 6 legs, 4 long, multi-jointed arms extending from its torso, and watching him with 3 very intricate heads. He could see the steam pouring from its back as it needed more than just bluestone to function, apparently. It reached up and carefully disconnected its middle head, setting into place on the new clocker they had made. The 4 long arms moving over the new clocker to tighten screws and check gears until it was satisfied. Then another clockard stepped forward with a chunk of raw bluestone the size of the gunslinger's clenched fists. They opened a panel in the back of its chest and set it inside before closing the panel. With that, the rest of the clockers backed up slowly and raised their arms to the sky. Then they began to sing. Except, it wasn't singing, it was chimes, like those in a clock. They chimed together in harmony to sing a wordless song that made the hairs on the back of the gunslinger's neck and arms rise further. There was a soft crackling in the air as the song seemed to reach its climax, and then the clocker in the middle jerked and popped for a moment before it opened its deep blue eyes and stood up straight. "I help." It crackled after a moment. Then the circle of clockers split before them and the gunslinger quickly walked past his new helper. The others began to sing a different song now with their chimes. It was sad and mournful, a ballad of loss for one of their kin as he turned and began to follow after the gunslinger, who didn't utter even a word of thanks to the clockers. He needed to continue. He hadn't expected his request for help to take so long. Once they were at the edge of the spire and the song of the mining clockers was beyond their hearing, he looked to his new associate once more. It was certainly bulkier than the others, more complex. "I hope you can fly," he muttered. It looked at him for a moment, and then the next spire before them across the chasm. It sank down then, crouching and pulling itself in, as if to make itself as small as possible. The gunslinger frowned as he watched, hearing the clocker creak and groan for a moment as gears spun and turned. Then it jumped high into the air, shooting forward like a spring as it crossed the distance and landed on the next spire only to turn and look at him. "Humph," was all the gunslinger could muster as he dove off the edge to catch the wind and rise up to join the clocker waiting for him. With that, they began to travel more earnestly, the gunslinger using the glider to catch the winds and gusts to carry him between the spires, while the clocker would watch and jump once he knew just where the gunslinger would land. On they went as the sun continued to climb through the sky. The gunslinger his destination, and could see it now in the distance. A lone peak among the flat spires. While he couldn't see it yet, he knew his destination was nestled into a valley in its shadow on the southern slope. A small homestead that lay claim to one of the most valuable resources there was in this place. Clear, clean water. The closer they got, the more the peak loomed over them, but it wasn't until the sun reached its peak high above their heads that they finally reached the base of the mountain. The gunslinger clicked the wings of his glider shut, knowing he wouldn't need it anymore. He thought about how best to approach. The thin, wispy trees that dotted the land before him blocking his view of the homestead he knew to be nestled further up the valley. But then he heard the crack of a rifle and the snap and whistle of staffs, and any hesitation fled. His legs and arms burned from his unrelenting travel, but still he ran forward then, pushed forward by a drive that wouldn't cease. Not now. Not so close. The clocker clanked along behind, keeping pace with the gunslinger as he ran between the trees. He saw the fence that marked the start of the homestead. It was wide open, but there were 2 marauders around it keeping watch. The talismans hanging from their belts were brown. He raised the carbine to his shoulder and fired. The first marauder's head snapped back and fell to the ground. The other spun and lifted its staff, but the gunslinger fired again, and that one dropped dead as well. "How can I help?" the clocker asked, even as the gunslinger ran forward once more. "Kill them all," was his only reply, not bothering to stop and wait for the clocker. It took a moment, but then the mechanical man changed. His left arm collapsed in on itself to form a sharp blade, while its right seemed to fortify itself as the hand turned into the head of a hammer. Even its head sank down into its chest a little, while a metal casing rose up so only its eyes were exposed. Then it ran to catch up with the gunslinger.